This full committee hearing is convening to review the need for leadership to combat climate change and protect national security. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Today, the committee is honored to have two distinguished witnesses, former Secretary John Kerry and former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. We welcome both of you. In addition to serving as key members of the Cabinet, both Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel served for many years in the United States Senate, and both served with great distinction. They also served in our armed forces, and they both served with distinction in combat. Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel, on behalf of the committee and on behalf of a grateful nation, I thank you for your service. I also thank you for joining us today to discuss the threat that climate change poses to our country and our national security. Just a few weeks ago, record-breaking floods forced parts of Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska under as much as 8 feet of water. Secretary Hagel, as you know very well, Offutt Air Force Base is home of the U.S. Strategic Command, and although they are used to floods, this year was nothing like they have ever seen before. Last September, Hurricane Florence caused massive damage to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. As a result, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Robert Neller, warned that, and I quote, "1/3 the combat power of the Marine Corps is degraded and will continue to degrade," end of quote. 1/3. For several decades, our national security leaders, including the two distinguished men sitting at our witness table, have been warning that we need strong and decisive leadership to combat climate change and to plan for national security implications we are going to face. These warnings have come from Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. In fact, in the most recent national climate assessment issued under the Trump administration, 13 federal agencies, more than 300 experts from around the country warned, and I quote, "The Earth is now changing faster than at any point in the history of our modern civilization, primarily as a result of human activities," end of quote. The assessment found that our response to this crisis so far has not been sufficient to avoid, and I quote, "substantial damages to the United States economy, environment, human health, and well-being over the coming decades." In addition, earlier this year, the President's Director of National Security, Dan Coats, warned that climate change is, quote, "likely to fuel competition for resources, economic distress, and social discontent through 2019 and beyond," end of quote. Director Coats also warned that heat waves, droughts, and floods driven by climate change are, and I quote, "increasing the risk of social unrest, migration, and interstate tension in countries such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Iraq, and Jordan," end of quote. Unfortunately, instead of mobilizing efforts to fight climate change, President Trump has attacked the science, weakened environmental protections, and undermined the leadership, United States leadership abroad. In fact, when his administration issued the National Climate Assessment last year, he stated, and I quote, "I don't believe it," end of quote. The title of today's hearing, "The Need for Leadership for leadership to combat climate change and protect national security is quite appropriate. I understand that there may be differences of opinion on how we should respond, but there should be no uncertainty about whether we should respond. If the President disagrees with the Paris Accord, that is his prerogative. But what he is proposing is instead will not work. According to press reports, he's reportedly considering creating a White House panel to relitigate whether climate change is real. A panel like that would be a huge step backwards for our nation and indeed the world. The true measure of leadership is whether we leave the world better for our children and our grandchildren and those yet unborn than we found it. Each day that we fail to act on climate change, we're risking the health, security, and the security of future generations. For these reasons, our committee is making climate change a top priority for this Congress. Today, the committee is making a referral to our subcommittee on the environment, which is chaired by the distinguished gentleman from California, Representative Ruda, to launch a series of hearings that will take advantage of our committee's unique and broad jurisdiction over all federal agencies, as well as over the executive office of the President, to identify opportunities for advancing concrete solutions.